The night was alive with the rhythm of raindrops, a soft drizzle falling over the city, coating the streets in a slick sheen that shimmered under the dim glow of streetlights. The golden reflections stretched across the wet pavement like fractured rivers of light, twisting and bending as headlights passed over them. The city hummed with distant traffic, an occasional siren wailing somewhere far away, a reminder that danger lurked in the unseen corners. In the front seat of a parked police cruiser, Officer Jake Carter adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the darkened streets with the precision of someone who had spent years on the force. A veteran of the K-9 unit, Jake had seen his fair share of action drug busts, high-speed chases, violent offenders. But tonight, something felt different. Beside him, sitting upright in the passenger seat, was Max, his trusted K-9 partner. The German Shepherd was more than just a working dog. He was a force of nature, a finely honed instrument of law enforcement. Max had been trained to track, to chase, to subdue. Over the years, he had earned a reputation as one of the best in the department, known for his relentless determination and almost uncanny ability to read a situation before it unfolded. Jake reached out, giving Max a firm pat on the side. "Ready, boy?" he murmured. Max's ears twitched, his sharp eyes locked onto the world beyond the windshield, as if sensing that something was about to happen. And then it did. The radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a 211 in progress at the Southgate warehouse. Suspects armed and fleeing on foot." Jake didn't need to hear anymore. He threw the cruiser into gear, tires screeching as the car peeled away from the curb. Max shifted in his seat, muscles tensed with anticipation. As they arrived at the scene, chaos was already unfolding. A black van screeched around the corner, nearly clipping a fire hydrant before coming to a skidding halt. 3 masked figures bailed out, scattering in different directions. Without hesitation, Jake and Max were in pursuit. "Go, Max!" Jake shouted, releasing his partner. Max leapt from the car like a bullet fired from a gun, his powerful legs propelling him forward with astonishing speed. His paws barely touched the ground as he tore through the rain-soaked streets, hot on the scent of the fleeing criminals. Jake followed, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he navigated the narrow alleyways behind him. One of the suspects veered left, disappearing into the darkness of a narrow passage between 2 old buildings. Max adjusted instantly, his instincts guiding him like an invisible force. But just as the chase reached its peak, just as Jake prepared for Max to take down the suspect, something completely unexpected happened. Max stopped, abruptly. Without warning, he halted mid-stride, his entire body stiffening. His ears perked, his head turning sharply toward the right, toward the mouth of a dimly lit alley. "Max, what are you doing?" Jake barked, skidding to a stop beside him. The suspect was getting away, but Max didn't seem to care. His attention was locked on something else. Following Max's gaze, Jake's eyes landed on a shadowy figure standing in the alley, partially illuminated by a flickering streetlight. The man was wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, his face obscured beneath the brim of a soaked hood. A homeless man. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. He was just another forgotten soul lost in the city's underbelly. And yet, Max was transfixed. "Come on, Max, we've got to move," Jake urged, but Max didn't budge. Instead, in an act that left Jake utterly stunned, Max turned away from the fleeing suspect, abandoning the chase entirely, and slowly approached the homeless man. Jake could only watch in disbelief as Max cautiously stepped forward, his tail neither wagging nor stiff, but his posture tense with something that looked eerily like recognition. "Max?" Jake tried again, his voice laced with confusion. Max ignored him. The German Shepherd stopped inches away from the man, his head tilting slightly as if trying to piece something together. And then, the most unexpected thing of all happened. The homeless man spoke. "Hey there, boy," he said, his voice raspy but strangely warm. Jake's pulse quickened. Max never approached strangers like this, especially not while in the middle of a pursuit. But what made Jake's breath catch in his throat was what happened next. Max whined, a soft, almost sorrowful sound. And then, before Jake could react, Max stepped even closer and pressed his nose into the man's hand. It was not the behavior of a highly trained police dog. It was not the response of an animal conditioned to ignore distractions and obey without question. It was the response of a dog recognizing someone he knew. "Who the hell are you?" Jake demanded, stepping forward, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered firearm. The homeless man slowly lifted his head, allowing the dim light to reveal his face. He was older than Jake had first thought, his features weathered by time and hardship. But his eyes, those eyes, held something deep: sadness, pain, and something else. Recognition. Not toward Jake, toward Max. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. This wasn't just some random homeless man. Max knew him well. "Guess he still remembers me," the man murmured, a ghost of a smile appearing on his lips as he reached out and gently scratched behind Max's ears. Max didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch. Jake's grip tightened around his holster. His mind raced. Who was this man? Why did Max react to him like this? And why did it feel like this moment was about to change everything? The rain continued to fall, the city continuing its endless hum, but for Jake, the world had just come to a screeching halt. Something was terribly wrong, and he was about to find out why. The rain continued to fall in a steady, rhythmic patter, each drop splashing onto the pavement like the ticking of an unseen clock counting down to something Jake didn't yet understand. He stood frozen in place, his breath misting in the cold night air as he watched Max press himself against the homeless man's side, his tail swishing low in an unmistakable display of familiarity. Jake's mind reeled. This wasn't just curiosity. This wasn't Max getting distracted or confused. This was recognition. "Max?" Jake tried again, his voice sharper this time. "Come." Max flicked an ear at the command but didn't move. Instead, he let out a low, almost pleading whine, his dark eyes locked on the man beside him. Jake's heart pounded. He had trained Max since the day they were paired together, had spent countless hours drilling commands into him, ensuring absolute obedience. Max had never hesitated before, never ignored an order. And yet tonight he was. Why? Jake narrowed his eyes and turned his attention to the homeless man. He was still standing there, his hood pulled low over his face, his frame wrapped in layers of threadbare clothing that barely seemed to shield him from the cold. The man hadn't moved much, hadn't even flinched when Jake's voice cut through the rain. He was watching Max with an expression that sent an uneasy prickle down Jake's spine. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, taking a step closer. His instincts were buzzing, every fiber of his being telling him that this man was not just another forgotten soul on the streets. The man exhaled slowly, a puff of warm breath escaping into the cold. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted a weathered hand and gently ran it through the damp fur behind Max's ears, his fingers moving with an ease that spoke of something more than just a chance encounter. "You still remember me, huh, buddy?" the man murmured, his voice rough but undeniably affectionate. Jake stiffened. "Still remember?" Something icy and sharp twisted in his gut. Max didn't respond like this to strangers. Not ever. "How do you know my dog?" Jake asked, his tone edged with suspicion. The man finally lifted his head, allowing the dim streetlight to cast shadows across his face. For the first time, Jake saw the deep lines around his eyes, the grizzled beard streaked with gray, the exhaustion etched into his features like a story carved in stone. "I trained him," the man said simply. Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. No, that wasn't possible. Max had been with the force for years. He had been assigned to Jake straight out of training. There was no way. "You're lying," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. The man huffed out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "No, officer, I'm not." His hand never left Max's fur, and Max never pulled away. Jake swallowed hard, His instincts told him that this man wasn't dangerous, but he was definitely hiding something. "You need to come with me," Jake said, shifting his stance slightly. He wasn't going to arrest the guy, not yet, but he needed answers. And he was damn sure going to get them. But then something unexpected happened. Max stepped in front of the man. Not aggressively, not defensively, but protectively. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "What the hell is going on here?" he whispered, almost to himself. Jake tried again, this time kneeling down to Max's level. He reached out, intending to take hold of his collar, to gently guide him back toward the police car. "Come on, Max, let's go, buddy." Max shrank away from him. Jake froze, a knot of disbelief tightening in his chest. Max had never once in all their years together resisted his touch. Never. He felt something inside him crack, something unsettling and foreign. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that Max had abandoned a chase, or the fact that he was choosing this man over him. "Max," Jake said again, his voice quieter now. "Why are you doing this?" The dog let out another low whine, looking from Jake to the man, as if torn between two parts of himself. Jake swallowed against the lump in his throat and looked up at the stranger again. "Who the hell are you?" The man's expression was unreadable. He hesitated for a long moment before sighing deeply. "My name's David Miller," he said finally, "and I wasn't always homeless." Jake's grip on his knee tightened. The name tickled at the edges of his memory, but before he could place it, David continued. "I used to be part of the K9 unit." Silence. Jake's mind stuttered like a record needle skipping over a scratch. "A K9 handler?" No, it didn't make sense. Jake searched his face again, looking for any sign of deception. And then suddenly it clicked. His breath caught. David Miller. It was a name he had heard in passing years ago, but not as a current officer. No, as a disgraced one. "You're lying," Jake said, but this time his voice was quieter, uncertain. David met his eyes steadily. "No, I'm not." Max let out a quiet huff and nudged his head under David's palm. Jake clenched his jaw. If what this man was saying was true, then that meant Max's connection to him ran deeper than Jake could have imagined. It meant Max had belonged to someone else before he was assigned to the department. Jake felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. "You were in the K9 unit," he repeated slowly. "But you're not anymore." David's jaw tightened. For the first time, there was something hard in his expression, something that looked a lot like bitterness. "No," he said. "I'm not." Jake stared at him. "Why?" David hesitated again, but then he shook his head. "That's a story for another time, officer." Jake hated that answer, hated the way it left too many loose ends. But for now, he had enough to process. His highly trained, highly obedient K9 partner had just abandoned protocol, had abandoned him to stand beside a man who should have been nothing more than a stranger. A man who apparently wasn't a stranger at all. Jake wasn't sure which truth unsettled him more. The fact that Max had once belonged to someone else, or the fact that Max still belonged to him, and he had no idea what to do about it. The rain had stopped, but the night remained thick with tension. Jake Carter sat alone in his police cruiser, parked just outside the station, his fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. The city hummed around him, headlights streaking past in blurred ribbons of light, but his mind was somewhere else, buried in the mystery of David Miller. He had spent the last few hours digging into the man's past, combing through old department records, archived reports, and anything he could get his hands on. What he found sent a chill down his spine. David Miller wasn't just some random homeless man. He was once one of the best K9 trainers the force had ever seen. His name had been everywhere, articles about record-breaking training programs, commendations for exceptional service, glowing testimonials from officers who had worked with him. He wasn't just good. He was a legend. And then, one day, it all vanished. Jake leaned back in his seat, exhaling sharply as he stared at the screen of his department-issued laptop. The official reports told a damning story. A case gone wrong. A crime pinned on the wrong man. A life destroyed. According to the files, David had been accused of planting false evidence in a high-profile drug bust. The case had collapsed, and with it, his career. There had been an investigation, but the evidence against him was flimsy, nothing concrete, just enough suspicion to ruin his name. The department had cut ties. No trial, no second chances, just a dishonorable discharge and a one-way ticket to oblivion. Jake clenched his jaw. It was too convenient, too neat. A man like David didn't just throw away a lifetime of service for something so reckless. Someone had set him up. But the real gut punch came when Jake looked into Max's records. His heart twisted painfully as he scrolled through the details. Max hadn't always been a police dog. He had been David's dog first. From the moment he was a tiny, untrained pup, David had raised him, taught him, shaped him into the extraordinary canine officer he was today. David had been there for Max's first steps, his first successful track, his first real mission. They had been a team, inseparable, until everything fell apart. And then Max was reassigned, given a new handler, a new life. David had lost everything. And yet, all these years later, on that rain-soaked street corner, Max had still remembered him. Jake shut the laptop and rubbed a hand over his face. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like a lead brick. This changed everything. The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside the alley where he had last seen David. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows down the damp pavement. Max sat beside him, alert but calm, as if he knew that today was different. Jake had spent the entire night wrestling with one painful question. What the hell was he supposed to do now? Legally, Max was a police dog. He had been assigned to Jake. The department had invested time, training, and resources into him. But emotionally, Max belonged to David. It wasn't a bond that could be broken by paperwork or protocols. It was deeper than that. Something primal. Something unshakable. Jake knew this feeling all too well. It was the same kind of loyalty that made a man charge into gunfire for his partner. The same kind of trust that meant watching each other's backs without question. It wasn't about ownership. It was about family. And now Jake had to decide. Did he take Max away from the man who had raised him, loved him, and lost him? Or did he let him go? Jake exhaled heavily, looking down at Max. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, his intelligent eyes scanning his handler's face, as if waiting for an answer that Jake didn't have. "Let's go find him," Jake finally muttered. Max didn't hesitate. They found David sitting behind an old abandoned diner, his back pressed against the brick wall, his hands cupped around a cheap gas station coffee. The steam curled in the morning air, but he barely seemed to notice it. He did notice Max, though. The second the dog trotted forward, David's entire body stiffened. His eyes widened slightly, and for a long moment, he simply stared. "Hey there, buddy," David murmured, his voice thick with something Jake couldn't quite place. Max moved forward slowly, as if afraid this wasn't real, as if afraid that if he got too close, David would disappear like a fading memory. Then at last Max pressed his head into David's chest. David's breath hitched. His hands trembled as they found Max's fur, fingers curling into the thick coat like he was trying to anchor himself in reality. Jake swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat. It was like watching a piece of something broken snap back into place. David let out a shaky laugh, one that sounded almost disbelieving. "You really didn't forget me, huh?" Max whined softly in response, pushing closer. Jake forced himself to clear his throat, drawing David's gaze. "I know," Jake said simply. David's expression shuddered. "What do you mean?" Jake gestured to the seat beside him. "I know what happened. I read the files. I know you got screwed over, and I know Max was your partner first." David said nothing. For a long moment he just stroked Max's fur, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. "You're a good cop," David finally said, "but the system, it's not always fair." Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." Another silence stretched between them, this one heavy with unspoken words. Jake knew what David was thinking. Is he going to take Max away from me, again? Jake took a deep breath. Then carefully he unclipped Max's collar. David's head snapped up in shock. "You trained him," Jake said, voice steady. "You raised him. You lost him once. I don't think you should lose him again." David's breath caught, and for a second Jake thought he might argue, but instead, David just closed his eyes, his fingers tightening around Max's fur. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Jake hesitated, but only for a second. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." David let out a shaky exhale, like the weight of years had just been lifted from his shoulders. Max didn't move. He didn't wag his tail, didn't bark. He just stayed there, pressed against David, as if he belonged there. Because Jake realized he did. Jake gave Max one last pat on the head before stepping back. "Take care of him," he said softly. David looked up, and this time his eyes weren't filled with pain. They were filled with something else. Gratitude. "I will," David promised. Jake nodded once before turning away. As he walked down the street, the weight in his chest didn't feel like loss. It felt like doing the right thing. And for the first time in years, Jake Carter knew without a doubt that he had. Jake Carter had always believed in loyalty. It was the foundation of everything he stood for. The trust between partners, between officers, between a handler and his K9. And yet, as he watched Max nestle into David's side, something inside him shifted. Max hadn't abandoned him. He hadn't disobeyed. He had simply found the person he had been searching for all along. That realization hit Jake harder than anything else. He had spent years forging a bond with Max, trusting him with his life, relying on him in moments of peril. And yet, in just a few fleeting moments, he saw that the bond Max had with David ran deeper, deeper than time, deeper than training. For Max, this wasn't about choosing between duty and loyalty. This was about family. Jake exhaled a slow, measured breath, his hands resting on his hips as he gazed at the man who had lost everything and the dog who had never forgotten him. There was only one thing left to do. The next morning, Jake stepped into Captain Morales' office, closing the door behind him. The older woman barely looked up from her reports, scribbling something in the margins before finally glancing his way. "You look like hell, Carter," she muttered. Jake huffed a dry laugh. "Yeah, it's been a long couple of days." Morales gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. Talk to me." Jake hesitated for only a second before lowering himself into the seat. He felt Max's absence beside him like a phantom limb. "Sir, I need to request an appeal on an old case." Morales finally put her pen down, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Go on." Jake took a deep breath. "David Miller, ex-K9 officer, discharged under suspicion of tampering with evidence." Her expression didn't change, but Jake caught the way she subtly straightened, her shoulders going rigid. "That case was closed a long time ago, Carter." "Yeah," he said. "And I think it was a mistake." She didn't respond immediately, simply studying him in that unreadable way of hers. "Let me guess," she finally said. "This has something to do with the fact that your dog abandoned an active pursuit to follow a homeless man?" Jake didn't flinch. Max recognized him. He knew him. And after looking into it, I think Miller was framed. Morales leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "Do you know how deep you're digging, Carter?" she warned. "If this case was mishandled, it's not just about clearing Miller's name, it's about exposing corruption. Are you ready for that fight?" Jake met her gaze evenly. "If it's the right thing to do, yeah, I am." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Morales sighed and rubbed a hand down her face. "You're a stubborn bastard," she muttered. "Fine. Bring me everything you've got. If we're going to do this, we do it by the book." Jake nodded, a spark of determination igniting in his chest. This was it. The fight wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about justice. Real justice. And he wasn't backing down. Over the next few weeks, Jake dug deeper than he ever had before. He combed through old reports, tracked down witnesses, and even confronted the officers who had been involved in the original case. What he uncovered made his blood boil. David Miller hadn't tampered with evidence he had been set up. The real culprit had been a high-ranking officer, one who had been covering for a botched undercover deal. David had discovered the truth, and in return, they had buried him, fabricating just enough false accusations to ruin his career while protecting their own. Jake presented the evidence to Morales, and within days, an internal investigation was launched. The corruption ran deeper than they had expected, but in the end, David was vindicated. The department publicly cleared his name. His record was expunged. He was no longer a disgraced officer. He was, once again, a hero. And through it all, Max never left his side. One evening, after the dust had settled, Jake found himself standing in the open field behind the precinct, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth lingering after the morning rain. A few yards ahead, David stood with Max, the dog bounding through the tall grass, his tail wagging wildly, his energy almost infectious. Jake smirked. He had never seen Max look this happy. David glanced back, catching Jake's eye. He hesitated before making his way over, hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. "Didn't think you'd come," David admitted. Jake shrugged. "Didn't think I'd miss it." David let out a small chuckle. "Feels strange, you know, being on the other side of this." Jake nodded. "You deserved better." David looked down at Max, who had trotted back to his side, tongue lolling in contentment. "I got him back," he murmured. "That's all that matters." Jake swallowed against the lump in his throat. "So, what now?" David exhaled, considering the question. "I don't know. Maybe I find a way to put my skills to use again. Maybe not in the force, but somewhere." Jake studied him for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a worn K9 badge. David's brows furrowed in confusion. "Max is still a damn good police dog," Jake said. "And you're still a damn good handler." He tossed the badge to David, who caught it reflexively. "I pulled a few strings. The department's officially retiring Max from active duty. But we need good trainers. If you're up for it." David stared at the badge, his fingers tightening around it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "Hope." "You serious?" he asked. Jake smirked. "Dead serious." David looked down at Max, who sat at his feet, his amber eyes gleaming as if he understood the weight of this moment. And then, for the first time in a long time, David smiled. As the last light of day stretched across the field, Max took off running again, darting ahead with the kind of freedom he had never known before. David called after him, his voice carrying across the open space, filled with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. Jake watched from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare smile tugging at his lips. He had done the right thing, not just for Max, not just for David, but for justice. For the first time in years, everything was exactly as it should be. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight, Jake turned and walked away, knowing that some bonds could never be broken. Some partnerships, no matter the time, no matter the distance, were forever. The world often defines loyalty in rigid terms: duty, obedience, unwavering service. It measures loyalty in rules followed, in missions completed, in orders executed without hesitation. But Max had taught Jake something different. Loyalty wasn't just about following commands. It wasn't just about duty. It was about love. It was about memory. Max had remembered David not as a handler, not as a superior, but as the man who had once been his entire world. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how many times Max had been called into the field, trained under a new name, assigned a new handler, deep down, he had never forgotten. That night in the rain, when the city blurred into darkness, when duty and instinct waged war inside of him, Max made a choice, and Jake chose to listen. Because sometimes, the system isn't always right. Sometimes the rules don't account for what truly matters. Sometimes, the heart knows best. Through everything, through injustice, through separation, through hardship, the bond between David and Max had endured, even when the world had tried to erase it. even when the years had stretched between them like an unbreakable divide. Even when everything should have told Max to forget, he hadn't, because true bonds can withstand any trial. It didn't matter that David had lost his badge. It didn't matter that the city had cast him aside. To Max, he wasn't just another forgotten man on the streets. He was still his partner, his family, and that kind of loyalty, the kind that defied time, defied orders, defied everything, wasn't something that could be trained. It was something born in the heart. And for Jake, that realization changed everything. As he watched Max bound through the open field, as he saw David standing tall for the first time in years, he knew he had done the right thing. Because in the end, loyalty isn't about who gives the orders. It's about who you'd fight to the ends of the earth for. And sometimes, that fight means breaking the rules. Did this story touch your heart? If you love emotional, powerful stories about loyalty and second chances, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss another story that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the bonds that truly matter. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Jake's place? Let's talk about it.